You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
1980, a football stadium in Southern California. The men arrive in vans. They're sporting huge night vision goggle helmets. The best technology available at this time. You can take a pitch dark night as if it's illuminated by a large green spotlight above you. The helicopters arrive. The men load up men and women onto the chopper. This happens at midnight, sometimes 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and it happens 6 times. Exactly the same procedure each time. In another area of Virginia, men are running up and down stairs with rifles, busting down doors, grabbing people out of room. When they're finished, they explode a hole in the wall and guide a group of people who are not armed through the hole. This is done many, many times, hundreds of times, to the point that the men know their procedures, exactly which rooms to hit, exactly which stairwells to clear. When they open up a door, they'll look at the hands of anybody, scan the hands first, who has guns, neutralize the threat. That's their orders. They're doing this so many times over a period of months that they can think of little else. They're sequestered from the rest of people. They're sequestered because this is a secret mission. And it could be the most important mission of their lives, or they could not be called at all. It's all up to the president. This mission never got to be really known as Eagle Claw, but that's what its name was. It's only known now as Desert One because the mission was canceled. And then it failed, and then there was a terrible accident and all of that in the middle of the Iranian desert. It was a plan to rescue the American hostages held in Iran during the final year of the Carter administration. It was a plan that Pentagon leaders did not support, did not think would succeed. But those involved in the mission, training for it, Delta Force leader Charlie Beckwith, for example, did think they could do it. Not everybody on Delta Force knew it was going to succeed. They were sure going to try or die trying. So did President Carter, because he orders a go on the mission. And I'll talk a little more detail on Desert One here in a second, because the question is, should he have done that? Could it have worked? And finally, if the mission didn't end up with a crash in the middle of the Iranian desert before it was even started, if it had instead led to the rescue of all 52 American hostages and bringing them home, wild celebrations, yellow ribbons on trees, people back in their hometowns, parades in every state in the country. Does Carter get reelected in 1980? And what happens? It's a discussion thread that I saw on Reddit. I thought it's a useful what if. I'll talk about that, but I first want to talk a little bit more about when we say, like, should he have made this call? Should Carter have made this call? You can go back and forth with the hypothetical. Could it have worked? The operation is covered very well in Mark Bowden's Guest of the Ayatollah, good book. But it goes like this. Helicopters, transport planes, and gunship planes, ground attack planes, would converge in a desert spot in Iran. That's the Desert One. Then, that spot was already scoped out. CIA and military intelligence had landed there already and gone back and scouted it all out. Looks like a good spot. They'll coordinate because the helicopters that are coming off an aircraft carrier are going to need to be fueled. They need more fuel by the time they get there, and they're going to need to be fueled by the transport planes, which they can do. Everybody refuels, everybody gathers. Then they go to a closer location, Desert 2, where 93 Delta Force members, dressed in like kind of shaggy clothing in addition to their armor and everything, bearded, some tanned, trying to look like they're not Americans, but perhaps an Iranian different faction within Iran. They're going to go there. Army Rangers are going to secure a nearby airstrip, which is not very well used. They don't think they'll have a problem securing it for the duration of what they want to be a very quick raid. They know the hostages because they have a CIA agent in Tehran. He's compromised the cook in one of the locations. They also, Iran at this point in 1980 has released members of the embassy staff previously, the women and any African Americans. One, Charles Robinson, who's a military officer, spent his short time as a captive, as it turned out, studying the embassy compound. He knew, like, for instance, which windows go in and out, how narrow are the stairways, things like this. They had actually a lot of intelligence. And because for the most part, most of the hostages were still in the embassy where the event started, and had to be, because for the politics of the Iran regime, the embassy was the center of all the public excitement about it was the den of spies where the Americans were. So you had to keep most of them there. There are some in the ambassador's residence. They're not stupid. They know they have to split them up. And there are some in another prison. The Americans know those locations, and they'll send separate Delta teams to attack those. They'll attack the embassy. They have conducted drills. They'll blow a hole in the wall, so they have to avoid getting everybody through doors, neutralize anyone who gets in their way. And they'll take the hostages across the street to where there happens to be a large soccer stadium. Helicopters will be waiting. When the teams from the ambassador's residence, the other prison, arrive, they'll put everyone on helicopters, get them out of there, get them to the runway. Copters will be destroyed, and everybody will get on the C-130s and get out of Iran. A lot of things can go wrong, and almost everyone agrees there. The Carter administration, the Delta team members, the Pentagon, everyone agrees there that there's many things that can go wrong. Everything from what if a crowd develops to what if, right in front of the embassy. Well, they have A-130 gunships that are designed to attack the ground. So anything they send, at least for the short duration of that raid, which they're going to try to get in and out of there as quick as possible with overwhelming force, anything you send at us, even a tank, is going to be dealt with by the planes up above. And the men have some fighting ability. They can't withstand a tank attack, but so that's one of their fears. Better resistance on the ground, alarms being pulled, guards seeing them before they arrive at the compound. All of these things, a last-minute move of the hostages, all of these things are possibilities that they're going to have to deal with. What if the copters can't take off because there's so much fire? They think they can control it with the airships, but what if the Iranian fighter jets are sent to attack the C-130s as they try to leave Iran? All of these are possibilities. A lot that can go wrong. Hostages could possibly be killed. And nobody wants that. Delta Force members, a lot of them feel that some of them will definitely be killed in this type of an operation. From Carter's point of view, you have almost universal agreement. I note that both Ronald Reagan and George McGovern in 1980 are saying there has to be some military solution here. And Carter's diplomatic steps are just not working, both his sanctions and also his attempts to negotiate. They're just not working very well to pressure the Iranians very well. New government set up in Iran, but they don't seem to be communicating with any real pathway to release these hostages. Carter can attack Iran's oil supply. They're worried that Iran, if they do that, will start shooting hostages. From Carter's point of view, this seems safer. Extract them, get them out, Eagle Claw, get the hostages home. You have a meeting where Carter's discussing it. Cyrus Vance is the kind of dove of the Carter administration, and he doesn't want this military mission. He's like, let's use negotiation. Let's get our people out. We have human rights groups that are coming in there. He said, look, here's one thing you don't understand. There's like 100 Americans in Iran. This is actually true. It's not like Iran had no Americans in it while these hostages are being held. They didn't take every American in Iran hostage. There are human rights groups there. There's some lawyers there. There's lots of news reporters there. There's like 100 news reporters. They could take even more hostages, Vance tells Carter. But Vance is noticing, from his account, the whole time he's talking about this, Carter's thoughts seem to be elsewhere. He realizes he's made a decision. Vance is going to end up resigning when Carter announces the mission, and he waits till after the mission's over to announce his resignation. And the rest, as they say, is history. Carter does give the mission a go. And in a dust storm, you lose the amount of helicopters are reduced from 8 to 5. They cannot continue the mission with 5. It's simply not enough fighters to overcome all the guards and assure that they're going to get the hostages out. Then while they're taking off, there's a lot of confusion. They're trying to get out of Desert One now as fast as they can. And a helicopter, he just cannot see and doesn't realize that he's moving at a certain point. He thinks he's under one of the transport planes, but he's actually moving, and he hits the plane. There's a fire. 8 service members are killed in Desert One, and they haven't even begun that Eagle Claw mission. They were trying to abort. So it's the worst of all worlds for Carter. When you get into the politics of things, there's a short period of sympathy for Carter reflected in some of the May Gallup polls, but polls start going down. Carter loses his re-election. He'll never quite recover from the failed rescue attempt. It also lengthens the time that the hostages are going to be negotiated for, because this angers Iranians. Okay, so I was asked this on Reddit. What if the American hostages in Iran had been successfully rescued on April 24th, 1980, with no repeat of the Desert One deaths and some deaths to the hostage takers? So imagine it's April 1980 and everything else is the same, with Carter facing all the same challenges. But the attempt to rescue the American hostages is, as this question asker says, a complete America-style success, including some casualties and deaths inflicted on the hostages' guards. Oh, I suspect there'd be a lot of that. What does this do to Carter's re-election attempt in particular, international relations, and American culture in general? Okay, cool question. A lot of people have a lot of different answers, but I would say it would be a miracle, and it would lead to a rise in patriotism, and that impacts Carter's situation in politics in 1980, no doubt. The only trouble is Carter's political situation is grim. And I think you got to be nuanced about it. And I would suggest that there is at least a scenario where he gets the hostages out, all of them, and still doesn't win re-election. There's at least a scenario for that. Let's take each piece. A successful rescue attempt at Operation Eagle Claw would be a miracle, not impossible. We've seen what special forces can do. And when you have night goggles and you can see and your opponents can't, that's going to be something. From the statements of Beckwith, who was leading the Delta Force, none of them would be there. Few hostage guards. I believe they were going to eliminate anyone who had a weapon at all as they were trying to rescue these people. Heavily armed, well armored. Yes, they had to worry about hostages. They were hoping on the surprise. Also the fact that Iran was not a settled political situation, so some of Delta Force's thinking is that the guards could be thinking this is like a hostile political group, which is not going to lead you to, you're going to fight, but you're not going to fight maybe as hard as if you see USA. They had no USA on their clothing when they were going to attempt this operation. Okay. If there's a successful operation, one of the first things that we have to look at is the political situation of Carter, and he'll end up having 3 opponents in 1980, Kennedy in the primary, and then Anderson and Reagan in the general election. So let's take Kennedy at first. This is where there's going to be the biggest effect and a political positive for Carter. Ted Kennedy's going to be out of the race. Why is that? Well, what can only be seen as a huge victory and a reaffirmation of his executive skill, of him as the president. You made the right call. Carter now knocks out Ted Kennedy decisively. Desert One failure directly led to Kennedy's wins in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania. They occur after that. And you could argue that the June California primary that happens is still a latent effect of Carter just being seen as a weak president. Maybe we're open to Ted Kennedy, who had been decisively beaten already in Iowa and New Hampshire. Kennedy's kind of able to come back. That's half Kennedy's delegates in the convention, those late primaries in 1980. That's what enables him to go to New York. He still doesn't have enough to win. Carter's got him outnumbered in terms of delegates, but he can stir up some trouble. It's a lot harder when you've got, say, 500, 600 delegates out of 3,000 to stir up any trouble and really make Carter look bad, which was a decisive factor in him losing the 1980 election. In reality, Ted Kennedy probably has to leave the race before the convention if he doesn't make that strong finish. Anderson, without a serious Kennedy challenge, I believe the domino of Anderson falls because I think Anderson jumps in because there's so much dissatisfaction with Carter on both the left and the right. It's a bit of a guess, but I base it on the fact that Anderson relied so much on that Democratic dissatisfaction to have a reason at all to jump in as a third-party candidate. Why he was charting in polls up as high as, say, 25%. A telling example is that his VP candidate was a Kennedy supporter. He's a former governor of Wisconsin. If you don't have a strong Kennedy challenge, I don't think Anderson able to mount much. Then you get to the general election versus Reagan. Carter's got a tough election still because after this foreign policy achievement, he's still got economic woes. Reagan will still be his opponent, I believe, because Desert One happens after Reagan's already secured the nomination in large part. So that doesn't change things. Absent Kennedy or Anderson, Carter gets to focus just on Reagan. And so all the non-Reagan has to go to Carter. Absent a hostage issue, Carter has more points in the polls, I believe. It's a Carter economy that's going to be the problem. It's still a recession in 1980. There's still high inflation. And no president has won re-election in a recession, so Carter would have to be first here. I believe there may have to be some kind of an electoral college win, which Carter was actually capable of because he had more support in the South than the North, which is odd for a Democrat these days, but not for Carter. And he had won 1976 with some groups of small states that are southern states, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, that voted for him as a Democrat, just barely, giving him which helped his electoral college look a lot bigger than his very small popular vote win. So maybe in 1980 you get a popular vote loss, but electoral win over Reagan. That's certainly a possibility. The issue against Reagan is, is he too extreme? And having a more unified front without a third party in the race to take on Reagan directly might have helped Carter with that. Tight race, though. I don't think you just give it to Carter just based on this. I'll throw a wild card in. Because with alt-hist, you get crazy. If Reagan perceives that stronger Carter is coming down the pike, when he's at Dallas at the convention, he may try harder or be more agreeable in trying to woo President Ford onto that ticket, to get that Reagan-Ford ticket, knowing that only a unified GOP is going to beat Carter. And having a former president on the ticket does it do better. So by Carter being a little stronger in the polls, does Reagan make this campaign move that would make his campaign stronger? Okay, let's look at polls. Carter starts in October of 1979, before the hostages are taken. He's down to 30%. It goes up, actually, after the hostage crisis, going up to 59% as approval rating. More importantly, he goes up against polls against Kennedy. By New Year, it's 56%. By March 1980, it's 43%. Not great, but the way Carter's presidency had been, not the worst. And by early April, it's down to 39%. Again, this is just a terrible economic situation and gas crisis and things like that. There's a little blip, actually, after Desert One in a May 7th poll to 43%. Perhaps sympathy, what have you, rally around the flag. Then it just goes, and then in terms of polls against Reagan, it's actually a little better for him with an opponent. This is why I believe he has a chance. It's just he had two opponents. So he's beating Reagan 62 to 33% in January of 1980. Even where his approval's at 56, he's beating Reagan 62 to 33% in the polls. Now we know it's a rally around the flag. Walter Mondale tells Ham Jordan that it won't last long if they get the hostages out. By March, he's beating Reagan 58 to 33. The trouble is, and what did we say as approval? In the same time, his approval rating is just 40%. So he's 40%, but when you put Carter up against Reagan, all of a sudden he has this rose-colored glasses, right, in that comparison. Trouble is, after that, they start including Anderson in these Gallup polls. Anderson's getting as much as 21%. So right after Desert won, the May poll in 1980, it's 40 versus 32% for Reagan. So this is bringing Carter's percentage numbers down because some people are going for Anderson. In July and August, Reagan starts inching over him, 45 to 29%. Carter ties it in September and then builds from there. The DNC convention and all the antics that Ted Kennedy brought looked bad for Carter. His speech was terrible, but Indiana did give the campaign a few points. That, and Reagan made a few missteps. 52% of Americans were telling Gallup that they were concerned about Reagan. 48% citing his age, 42% citing he might get us into a shooting war. Carter's at 45% right before the election. That's in a three-party split. Reagan's getting 39, Anderson's getting 9. So it's 45 Carter, Reagan 39, 9. The trouble is that final debate right before the election. Reagan does well, Carter does terrible. Last Gallup, 47 to 41. Reagan over Carter. Anderson with 8%. That's going to be within 3 points of what actually happens in the election. Like 53, 39, 6. When you look at those polls and you start to say, what happens when instead of starting with what happens when you've had this boost in April? Does Carter lose all of that? When he was able to come back a bit, even without a hostage rescue, if he was able to come back a bit September and October in the polls against Reagan, what happens when he has this fantastic rescue? And that's just something that we'll never know. I lean towards probably a close Carter win, but I don't declare that that's the only thing that could have happened. It's the best I can say. I would totally believe a scenario where Reagan still wins the election based on the economy is poor. And people say, that was great. Thanks for rescuing the hostages. That was in April. The one thing that's clear is the electoral map gets closer. And I believe both Kennedy and Anderson are knocked out of this crazy 1980 election. And it's an easy Carter versus Reagan, which is more favorable to him.
I'm at Memorial Bridge Park here in Bismarck, North Dakota, on the banks of the Missouri River.
In 1918, America joined the war against Germany, World War I. You have war fever in parts of the U.S. Anything Germans considered un-American, changing the name of hamburgers to Liberty sandwiches, Dachshunds to Liberty pups. Sauerkraut is now called Liberty cabbage. You got names of places actually changing. In Minnesota, the village of New Germany changes its name to Motordale. In Missouri, Potsdam changes its name to Pershing in honor of the World War I general. So it still has a German name in effect. In Ohio, New Berlin becomes North Canton. Berlin, Michigan is named Marne, commemorating the soldiers who died in the Battle of the Marne. Tennessee's Germantown temporarily becomes Neshoba, a word that means wolf. It'll get turned back. It's an odd thing that's happening in America. You have lots of Germans. It's one of the largest non-English speaking nationalities in America. It was the largest, and now it's been surpassed by those of Hispanic heritage. German heritage is the second in terms of non-English. All right. So it begs the question, what's happening in North Dakota, where the capital of the state is named Bismarck?
North Dakota State Capitol building here in Bismarck?
In honor of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. It's, by the way, the only U.S. state capital named for a foreign state. It was originally going to be called Edwintown in 1872 because there was a man who was involved with the railways, named Edwin Johnson. But Northern Pacific stockholders thought if we change the name to Bismarck, we could encourage German capitalists to invest in our railways. Maybe we can get German immigrant settlers to the area. As it is, there's a large number of Germans that do settle in North Dakota. That was 1873 that the town becomes Bismarck. Now we're at war against Germany. And the Fargo's Women's Relief Corps petitions the governor of North Dakota, Lynn Fraser, please change the name of the capital city to something that sounds more English, more American. And probably uniquely across America, this is the only town that's able to beat back this charge and keep its name. And you have a large German-American population in North Dakota helps. Governor Lynn Fraser says it would not be advisable to change the name of the state capital. It would just do too much damage to such an important place, and we're going to keep it intact. They also use Bismarck in their argument. Bismarck died in 1898. He had nothing to do with starting World War I. And indeed, he disagreed with Kaiser Wilhelm in a lot of cases. He had nothing to do with the present trouble in the world, the governor says. He gets support from the editor of Devil's Lake World. Bismarck, they argue, was forced to resign by Wilhelm. He wanted to have a semi-friendly relationship with France. He wanted to remain allied with Russia. He didn't want to build a fleet to compete with the UK. He wanted peace generally in Europe. He sponsored the Berlin Congress of 1878 to get that done. They wrote, changing Bismarck's name would be a foolish action, defying history and denigrating common sense. I wouldn't trade the entire Balkans for the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier, is a quote that Bismarck had said. Bismarck would have communicated directly to the Russians, some argue. He wouldn't have let Austria dictate policy. Would have told them they have to restrain Austria from violating the independence of Serbia. Bismarck stands pat on destiny. Bismarck stands pat on its name. During the time of the war, 35,448 men from North Dakota would serve in the armed forces. 1,300 of them would not make it home. Women from North Dakota also served as nurses through the Red Cross or the Army Nurse Corps. 20% of registered nurses in North Dakota sign up for the war effort. There are memorials to World War I dead all over North Dakota. In the town of Bismarck, 2 plaques honor Lloyd Spetz, the first soldier from Bismarck to die in the war. The other plaque memorializes Teddy Roosevelt's son, Quentin Roosevelt. There is a Lloyd Spetz American Legion Post No. 1 in Bismarck today.
It's a smart clothing store today, but 50 years ago it was a bank and the scene of Sweden's most notorious hostage drama.
Stockholm Syndrome is the name given to a scenario where a hostage starts to sympathize with the hostage taker. The Patty Hearst story is a famous example of that, where she was captured by the Symbionese Liberation Army, the SLA, in 1974, and then started robbing banks with them and other things. But Stockholm Syndrome gets its name after the events in Sweden and has a number of problematic components, as it turns out, as does the Patty Hearst story for this. I mean, is Stockholm Syndrome even real? If you had asked me this a couple of years ago, I would have said yes. There's a famous case in Sweden. After I looked at it, not as much. I, like most people, probably think it's an actual condition. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines Stockholm Syndrome as the psychological tendency of a hostage to bond with, identify with, or sympathize with his or her captor. But the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, doesn't define Stockholm Syndrome in it. Not only that, it's never been submitted for inclusion. So it's probably not well known that Stockholm Syndrome is a term that was foisted upon one woman who was a hostage by a psychiatrist who had never met her, never looked at her records, or considered her. No condition exists in any psychiatry document. And the woman who is labeled as a victim of Stockholm Syndrome is now actually herself a therapist and is adamant it didn't happen. that does not describe her or her actions on the days accurately. It's possible the whole thing comes out of much more logical explanation, or even that police were covering up their actions and thus invented the term. Let's start in Sweden. Stockholm Syndrome is high up there on the psychological terms familiar to members of the public. A lot of people throw it around, kind of like OCD, right? We do this. These things enter the mainstream, and we're all doctors all of a sudden. We don't have an understanding.
The syndrome has often carried negative connotations. Some say that's not fair.
I think many can identify what happened in the Stockholm Syndrome original situation, because this is a phenomenon that can happen, for example, in domestic violence or other kind of abusive situations. And by understanding what really happens in the victim during the Stockholm Syndrome situation, it can help to remove some guilt and to remove some feelings of shame in the victim.
It starts when Jan Erik Olsson, a convicted criminal, is released on furlough from prison. And since he doesn't do anything else and hasn't reformed in prison, he walks into a bank, the beautiful clock-adorned Credit Banken Bank in Norrmalmstorg, neighborhood of Stockholm, on August 23rd, 1973. To scare everyone, he fires into the ceiling. This is kind of silly because it alerts authorities, and as it's a heavily trafficked square and police are close, they arrive quickly. And he hadn't been able to get his money and get out of there. He doesn't have much of a plan. He's not used to this. He's never taken hostages before. First time for everything, Olsson takes 3 hostages inside the bank. He finds another bank employee is in a storeroom, takes him hostage. He demands the equivalent of 700,000 in Swedish and foreign currency, and that he be provided a car and allowed to leave and escape. While he's making demands, he makes an odd request. Release another criminal. Someone he had met in prison, Clark Olofsson. So Olsson is the bank robber. Olofsson is the guy that's in prison. He met him, and he said, I want him to come here. Olofsson's like a legend, and he's seen as very charismatic, he's handsome, tells stories, and somebody who's very popular in the prison. I don't know exactly what Olsson's thinking is. Perhaps he's thinking, either I want to do him a favor or I need 2 brains on this. Sweden doesn't get a lot of bank robberies. And there's a lot of attention here. The news cameras are on this corner. Everyone in Sweden is following this story. This type of armed hostage crisis just unheard of. The police had no blueprint for what to do. As one day becomes 2, the media is bringing a lot of criticism. Prime Minister's involved, the government's involved here. A picture in the newspaper the next day would show press photographers and police snipers side by side on a roof opposite the Credit Banken Bank. And everyone starts thinking, this doesn't happen in Sweden. Even the hostages think, this never happens in Sweden. What's going on? This is like something from America. Even the police think they don't know who Olsson is initially. He's just, there's a guy robbing bank and taking hostages. They think he's an American that's come to Sweden. They're helped by the fact that Olsson has decided to change his voice a bit, to use an American accent to disguise things. So to break the stalemate, they say, okay, this is an odd request, but we're going to bring your friend Olofsson here, he hasn't robbed banks before. He hasn't taken hostages before. He's done other crimes. Police tell him, look, you cooperate with us, and we might be able to help you get a good sentence. Try to get this guy to not do any harm to everybody. So far, you have this Isn't that sound like something that would be a great movie? I'm surprised Stockholm Syndrome is what came out of this whole story. Instead of a really cool plot, police trying to use another criminal to talk down a situation. Help us with this. Help us make sure people don't get hurt, and maybe we'll help you. And it does help initially. Olsson has been kind of very tense during the negotiations, very short with the cops, is now seems a lot calmer. So Enmark, Ludblund, Oldgren, and Sofstrom are kind of able to talk with Olofsson. They arrange to have some food sent in there. They have a communication device. There's a camera, so eventually they sneak a camera through the wall so they can see the hostages and be sure that they're safe. Police can monitor that. In their ingeniousness, the police decide, well, we've located who this bank robber is, and we have his brother. We're going to send his brother in to try to talk him down. And so they're now sending the guy's brother along with a police officer and figuring that Olson, well, they don't know he's Olson, will recognize his brother and everything will be great. Except the police didn't have the right man. And they thought that he was another infamous bank robber who had previously escaped from prison. And he doesn't know who these two people are, one police officer and some guy, and he fires at them. Luckily, no one's hurt, but they run. And now Olson is more annoyed. The whole thing's covered on the news. And the bank robber, who Swedish authorities believed was the one that they had and whose brother they sent in, he's hiding in Hawaii. And very stupidly, he announces to television stations that I'm not the guy, I'm here in Hawaii. Of course, he's arrested soon and put back into prison. It really makes a great movie. Nearly 3/4 of the population of Sweden are tuning into this on TV. It's very high pressure. And the Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme, gets involved. Jan-Erik Olsson talks with him, talks with the Prime Minister of Sweden. He allows hostage Enmark to also call him. He rings the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister is smart. He tries to keep Enmark on the phone. Here's from the UK Independent. Both Jan-Erik and Miss Enmark ring the Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme, and he takes the calls. He spends nearly on the phone. Enmark shares her fears of dying at the hand of police in a bungled rescue operation. You guys messed this thing up with the guy's brother. Now what are you going to do? Enmark claims that what the Prime Minister says back to her is that, well, should you be killed during a police attempt to squelch the standoff, you should be content to have died at your post. So Kristin Enmark is trying to say, look, don't bungle this up. And the fact that she has the same message as the hostage taker makes an impression on the Prime Minister and the police. This goes on for 6 days. The police want to use a gas attack. Enmark asks them, please do not use gas because he's threatening at the first sign of gas, he will kill us. Nonetheless, police storm the bank with tear gas. And although he had threatened to kill them, he doesn't. Police arrive with gas masks and take Olson into custody. Kristin Enmark had not behaved in the way police expected, and they are critical of the police actions. So a consultant psychiatrist, Niels Bergeau, who had never met and never treated Kristin Enmark, explains, this is Normalström syndrome, which in America will become Stockholm syndrome. Now, one of the things that Kristin Enmark will discuss that's going to be very important in this case is about the car, and the demand that Olson has is like put Olson, and the hostages in a car, allow us to escape, and this thing will be over. Well, the police, and I can't blame them, say, well, no, we're not going to let you take any hostages. They do eventually agree, police negotiators, we're going to provide a car for you. And you, Olson, and Olofsson, the man that we place there, can escape. This is where Kristin Enmark's actions can be interpreted, because she calls the Prime Minister of Sweden, Palme, and says, let all of us leave. Over the day or so, she has some trust with Olofsson. He believes he can talk Olson down, but not while this is going on. Get him in a car, allow him to leave with us, the hostages. We can at least get this out of the bank and where he feels less threatened. Now, the police are just simply not going to do that. Now, the police position is reasonable. Whether you agree or not with Enmark's position that I, as a hostage, want to be allowed to escape in the car with them, it's valid, it's viable, and it's logical. It may not be right, because she could certainly be killed in such a case. But it's one of many logical options. It doesn't represent a weird psychological condition, because what she's essentially saying is, like, here in this bank situation, with all this tension, there's a possibility we're going to all get killed. Okay? You're not giving him what he wants. He's running out of options here. Let's take our chances with the car. That's interpreted later. That's a key part that's interpreted later, along with Enmark having complained about the police behavior to the press, that she was in this Stockholm syndrome where she developed a deep connection with the hostage takers and started to sympathize with them. It's absolutely untrue. She did not sympathize with Olsen, the original hostage taker. She did feel that Olofsson, who police had sent in there, even though he's a criminal, she felt that he was doing a lot to calm Olsen down and to communicate with police and try to resolve the situation. So in this bad situation she found herself in, she trusted Olofsson. It was not a deep relationship. One of the things that gets conflated is Olofsson's going to be all over TV. He's going to end up having a larger career in crime, but he's also going to get a lot of press attention. He will end up having a lot of like marriage proposals. And there's kind of like an urban legend that floats around that Enmark got married to Olofsson. And that's absolutely not true. It was someone else he had met and married after these events. So all of this gets conflated. And so you don't really have a lot to base this Stockholm Syndrome real case on. Enough of that. I just thought that was an interesting story. I've also read recently a book, The Patty Hearst Situation. Another interesting story, and where it's not as simple as brainwashing, where among other things, Hearst's own father thought that she had some radical views to begin with. So when she got kidnapped by the SLA, now she wasn't in cahoots with them initially, and she was a victim, but she also had some radical views and might have welcomed the chance to do something against the establishment and things like that. So you have these really complex situations that are explained in simple terms. From Abraham Dittenhofer's How We Elected Lincoln, Personal Recollections. A man whom I knew well discovered the president at his office counting greenbacks and enclosing them in an envelope. He asked Mr. Lincoln how he could spare the time for such a task in the midst of such important duties that were pressing upon him. And Lincoln replied, "President of the United States has a multiplicity of duties not specified in the Constitution of the laws. This is one of them. It is money which belongs to a porter from the Treasury Department. He is now in the hospital, too sick to sign his name, and according to his wish, I am putting part of it aside in an envelope, properly labeled, to save it for him." An eyewitness relates that one day while walking along a shaded path from the executive mansion to the War Office, he saw the tall form of the president seated on the grass. He afterward learned that a wounded soldier, while on his way to the White House seeking back pay and a pension, had met the president and asked his assistance, whereupon Mr. Lincoln sat down, looked over the soldier's papers, and advised him what to do. He ended by giving him a note directing him to the proper place to secure attention. Driving up to the hospital one day, he saw one of the patients walking directly in the path of his team. The horses were checked none too soon. Then Mr. Lincoln saw that he was nothing but a boy, and had been wounded in both eyes. He got out of the carriage and questioned the poor fellow, asking his name, his service, and his residence. "I am Abraham Lincoln," he said, upon leaving, and the sightless face lighted at the president's words of sympathy. The following day, the chief of the hospital delivered to the boy a commission in the Army of the United States as first lieutenant. The papers bore the president's signature and were accompanied by an order retiring him on 3/4 pay for the years of helplessness that lay before him. "Some of my generals complain that I impaired discipline in the Army by my pardons and respites," Lincoln once said. "But it rests me after a hard day's work, if I can find some excuse for saving a man's life, and I can go to bed happy as I think how joyous the signing of my name will make him and his family and his friends." Mr. Lincoln was famous for disposing of office seekers without leaving a sting behind. H.C. Whitney told his story to a friend of mine. "I had business in Washington in 1861 pertaining to the Indian Service, and I remarked to Mr. Lincoln that everything is drifting into the war, and I guess you'll have to put me into the Army." Lincoln smiled and said, "I'm making generals now,